Welcome to the New Books Network.
And welcome back to New Books in Sociology, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Nafisa Andrabi, the host of the channel. Today, we'll be talking to Kamran Khan about his new book, Becoming a Citizen: Linguistic Trials and Negotiations in the UK. Kamran is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Universidad Oberta de Catalonia. Kamran, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Kamran, I wonder if you could begin the interview by telling us a bit about yourself, that is, where you were born, where you went to school, how you became interested in citizenship in the UK, and how you landed in Catalonia.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm from Birmingham in England, which is the second biggest city in England. And my parents came over from Pakistan, so I'm from a family of immigrants. And even growing up, I saw a lot of issues around immigration, people applying for things, going to our house. And so I always had some sort of interest. It's kind of like fairly detailed uh, kind of knowledge about how belonging works on a kind of legal basis. From there, I went to university and did languages, and I went into English language teaching after my undergrad. And Birmingham has a lot of migrant communities over a period of time, and there's projections it may become the first city in Europe that would have an ethnic majority, for example, in the future. And so I used to teach migrants and refugees. From there, I decided to do a PhD in Birmingham, in my home city. And I did that between Birmingham and Melbourne in Australia as part of the scholarship. And it was around the issue of citizenship, which was actually an idea from my supervisor at the time, Professor Adrian Blackledge. And that kind of tied a lot of kind of things I had and was interested in from my kind of professional history of teaching migrants, my personal history of being within a community, within a kind of city that's famous for immigration. And so that's how it all kind of started. In terms of Catalonia, so my family's here now, and I'm doing a postdoc. So obviously the book is about the British context, and I'm now working on the Catalan context of how the citizenship test is kind of experienced on an everyday level.
Awesome, thank you. I didn't know very much about Birmingham, so that was interesting. What kind of migrant groups are in Birmingham predominantly right now?
So I don't know if this is actually true, but this is something they used to say in my community. They say that I think one of the biggest Pakistani communities outside of Pakistan is in Birmingham.
Oh, wow.
So there's that. But I think, historically, there's been Jewish communities coming over, and kind of just before us was kind of the Irish community. So a lot of, so I went to a school where most kids were children of immigrants. So most of the white children in the school were actually Irish immigrants. And then there was kind of my generation, which is more kind of, from the Commonwealth. So it has a kind of colonial link from the Caribbean, from India, from Pakistan. And since, kind of newer generations are from, places like Somalia, Iran, so a big Kurdish community. That's probably how it is. I mean, it's a lot more diverse. There's kind of more migrant communities now, setting up. And actually, one of the things is there's a famous sociological book by John Rex. I think it's Race, Community, and Conflict. And actually, that was based in Birmingham, so that kind of gives you a flavor for the city.
Nice. Yeah, that actually sort of leads into something I wanted to, your book is covering some really interesting history of British citizenship. And you touched on this a little bit, that folks are migrating in, and there's a little bit, the colonial link, and how the Commonwealth is shaping some of these discourses around British citizenship. So I wondered if you wanted to share a little bit about that history that you cover in the beginning of your book.
Yeah, so the kind of idea of a national citizenship really kind of takes shape in 1981 with the British Nationality Act, which is quite unusual given, kind of long institutional histories that kind of there are in the UK. But traditionally, until then, it'd been this kind of idea of being a Commonwealth subject. And kind of post-war, there was this kind of idea of trying to keep Commonwealth countries, somehow together. And because obviously a lot of countries were becoming independent, and so they had this idea of Commonwealth subjects. But actually, what it ended up doing was there was kind of a lot more migration to the UK because there was subjecthood from the kind of metropole. And over time, there would be these kind of different legislations which would make immigration more restricted. And eventually, they got to the point in 1981 where national citizenship kind of became a way of cutting away from that kind of colonial link and focusing really on the national subjecthood. So it started in 1981, and there was actually a kind of language requirement within it, but actually it was rarely used in reality. And it was kind of assumed you spoke English unless you showed you couldn't. That's what I found just from conversations I had. And then 2001 is really the key point where it really starts picking up. And as I write, there were riots in 3 northern cities over the summer, and they involved far-right extremists and mainly Asian communities. And the tension built up to the point where they had these kind of riots. So it kind of became this thing about why don't they integrate? What's caused all of this? And so there was this idea that these were kind of fractured communities, and so citizenship became kind of the focus point of political debates as a way of kind of reuniting kind of this splintered community. And obviously, one way of doing that is a common language, and so they set about creating a citizenship test, which actually I think the first one was in 2005. So that's kind of a brief history. But what's really interesting is that citizenship became a way of defining who belongs, but actually, it's really based on who doesn't belong as well. And I think that that kind of carries over into the way the citizenship test is then functioning within this kind of legislation.
Yeah, this is so my parents are also from Pakistan, but they migrated over to the US. So and I just watched The Crown with them, so I basically know all of British history now.
Okay.
And and they I just remember this one line from it where I think the queen says, we are all one big imperial family.
Yeah.
And I had a very different reaction to watching that show than my parents did. And I was like, you are such colonial subjects right now watching this, show. And they were so immersed in it. And being second generation, I had a very different response. But so there's this shift from sort of seeing this broad imperial family to like uh as the sort of imperial strength of Britain is decreasing, having to shift more to this sort of nationhood focus.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And before that, what was, so how did you're saying so language was sort of one aspect of citizenship. Did they evolve together in that region, or have there been sort of other times when different aspects of citizenship are more or less salient, or how did it become that language became such a critical point of the conversation around citizenship and nationhood and belonging?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been different ways really that immigration has kind of played out. There was kind of really racist discourse. I mean, as in explicitly racist, using the N word, for example, in the '60s as part of political campaigns. But obviously, what's different with kind of the Commonwealth kind of immigration is uh, a lot of them would have. I mean, I guess it's the same for your family. Would have had a decent knowledge of English before they came, right? But I think what they've been able to do since 2001 is really make language a kind of way of differentiating and some sort of kind of symbolic aspect as well of showing you want to belong. And also, let's not forget as well, English is a really good way in terms of the language of looking at the way colonialism plays out. So historically, English has been one of the things that's been used to expand borders from the UK through the Commonwealth, through the British Empire. So what's interesting here then is it was English, of educating people in English in distant countries was a way of expanding the borders. But when it came to withdrawing from all of that and actually starting to make very explicit who belongs, English became a way of kind of excluding as well, and kind of really kind of shutting the door almost, you know, for certain people. Obviously, it doesn't. You know, you can still pass the test, but it's a pretty good indicator of the way in which the kind of borders have kind of expanded and then contracted again. You know.
Right. Yeah, it's making me think of. I mean, I spent a couple of years living in Pakistan when I was in elementary school, and we've gone back and forth a lot. And um, I was always fascinated with people speaking English in British accents and trying to replicate the British accent.
Yeah.
Which, when I got older, I was like, okay, got it. Internalized colonialism.
Yeah.
And the other is just, I remember having this conversation with my dad, who was saying, overnight when the British, changed, took away basically Punjabi and these national languages that were spoken by the populace, and made sort of English and Urdu these dominant languages that were spoken in the modes of education and the modes of communication. They essentially rendered the country, illiterate, unless you were sort of speaking the language of the colonial power. And I think about that a lot now when there's, in these different countries, when we're seeing what language education is happening in, what languages are prioritized in the workforce, what languages are prioritized in schooling and higher education. And yeah.
Yeah. Actually, and adding a kind of social linguistic perspective on that, often beliefs around languages, transfer to the populations of those speakers as well. So if there's prestige with certain languages, that's kind of passed over to that population as well. So my point is that often the beliefs we have about speakers and non-speakers, in terms of what the beliefs about their languages, is pretty much what we think of that group as a kind of people as well. So there is a kind of deep, even within that, there's a kind of deeper resonance of kind of
Right.
imposing English on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, you started to talk a little bit about the citizenship tests. I had two questions. One, you mentioned 2001, and I come from this U.S. perspective, which is more where most of my training and most of my research has been. So I was curious about whether there was something, what was significant about sort of 2001 as this temporal shifting point. And I think about 2001 as this, when 9/11 happened. And so I'm just wondering if there are any, parallels, or if there's any relationship there. And then I'm also sort of wondering if you could just describe a little bit what these citizenship tests were like, and if they were based off of anything historical, or if they sort of emerged purely out of that moment.
Yeah. So 2001, obviously, most people will straight away think about 9/11. The riots actually happened in that kind of summer before that. And what's maybe quite significant about this, and I think Anne Marie Fortier writes about this, is that the people involved in the riots, most of them would have been born in the UK. So it wasn't a case of kind of migrant riots or anything like that. People who'd been born abroad and then suffered some sort of racism or anything like. Although they may have as well. But what's significant is that they were born in the UK, and I think the expression that's kind of used, if I remember correctly, in her book was, these were kind of the sons of multiculturalism. So it's actually defined a kind of failure of the kind of model of pluralism as well. So that's actually quite significant, because also you can kind of draw a link then to the 2005 bombings in London that we had, because they too, I think 3 of the 4 were born in the UK. So there's this kind of a thing, that they were born in the UK, and so why do they feel like this? And for example, that's a big difference from the US and 9/11, where the hijackers were all from outside of the US. So it's almost easier to rationalize that these people came from outside and they brought this kind of conflict and this atrocity to the country. So that's one significant difference. So coming into the test itself, it's multiple choice questions, and so they're about different aspects of British life. So there's been 3 different versions of the test, and I think for the first one they consulted, like for example, English teachers, ESOL teachers, we call them, English for speakers of other languages, which refers to adult migrant education in the UK. And there were kind of jokes as well. It's not only happening in England, but it's happening in Australia, for example. The kind of first set of questions, there's things that people think are maybe not necessary, they're kind of jovial. And then some questions in the second version, it's more towards kind of helping people to with different services and accessing help. And then the third one, and this is very broad. There's, from what we've heard in a second. So I've done another project after the book where we interviewed, over 150 people about very similar things about citizenship. And what was coming across was that with the third one, there was a lot more kind of ideological stuff about art and the facts that people were feeling were kind of maybe a bit irrelevant to daily life, or a bit more kind of given a very, very distinct image of English and British life and things that, supposedly you should know. So that's one of the things I think we have to keep in context, is that the test can be different at different times. And, it may change again in the future. So that's it in a nutshell. You need 18 out of 24 to pass. You can take them online as kind of practice as well, just to see how you fare. And so it's all in English. The preparation material is in English. So that's kind of more or less how it functions.
Thank you. It reminds me a little bit of conversations that are happening in the US around standardized testing, and specifically what you were mentioning about sort of shared culture and assumption of knowledge of various, sort of art and music. And I remember reading this example of, they, a word that was described as a yacht, or, the word choice was yacht. And this was a standardized test in the US for fourth graders. And the sort of debate or question was, what types of fourth graders have access to knowledge about yachts, and is that really a word that that we should be using in standardized testing to gauge what we're trying to, what the mo is it's about generalized knowledge or whatever. But so I was just thinking about that. So your book is an ethnographic study that follows the journey of W as they attempt to gain UK citizenship. So could you tell us a little bit about W? How did you meet them, and how did you decide that this was the story as you were starting this research? And if you want to describe a little bit about what the process was of starting this book project, or the research for this book project, and how you sort of came into the sort of narrative that you ended up choosing.
Yeah, sure. So, as I said, originally the idea was actually devised by my supervisor at the time, which was generally to spend time with the class and see, how they do citizenship classes at the time. And there's different ways that can be implemented. It can be implemented within a college. So college for us in this context means kind of adult education, not necessarily university. So so the idea originally was to spend time with the class. And the one thing I should make clear here then is that it's in my neighborhood, and this is where I've grown up, and it's where my family is, and it's mainly Muslim area. I don't know what the statistics are now off the top of my head, but I mean it's very distinctly Muslim. And for example, the college I went to, I knew people there. I was able to walk home, but it was a short walk home. So it's very, very kind of familiar surroundings. Within that, then, the idea was always the class knew that I'd be coming in and maybe focus on particular people and then their kind of journey. And I got to know W, and the first thing, I mean, he was really smart, very, very sharp. And the whole class was really nice. The kind of typical atmosphere that I experienced as a teacher. And we talked, and he said, I can show you, things, my community and how things work. So that was quite interesting already, because he's Yemeni, and we live in the same neighborhood, and so there was this whole world. Even though we shared religion, for example, similar backgrounds, both males and, like I said, both Muslim. But then he showed me all these things which I'd never really encountered before, because I stick with mainly Pakistani people in my neighborhood, and he sticks mainly with Yemenis, which is not unusual. So that's how we got to know each other. And as time went on, I think what was becoming clear was actually the stuff going on outside the classroom was really interesting. And what working with him did was kind of bring everything for me together from my teaching background and as just someone who has grown up in that same neighborhood. It kind of by moving from the classroom to outside, I was able to kind of bring everything together. And so so I think the point where it started clicking for me that really he might be better almost at kind of guiding me through this and was when he described how he passed the test, which we can come on to shortly. But when he described the actual thinking that went on, it's very different from what goes on in the classroom in the way he handled it. And I thought at that point there's a really interesting journey here, and we got on well as well. And so we'd meet quite often. We did other things together. For example, he took me to Friday prayers where he goes, which is somewhere where I've never been, and so that was like a different experience for me. And I got to do all these different things within different places over a period of time. And at the end of it, he gets his citizenship. Yeah, so that's kind of how it works. So it's a bit of trust, really, of having some flexibility about not being tied down to very dogmatically following what you want, but still having the spirit of what I was looking for at the beginning of how do people become citizens. But it became really clear that this was a really interesting way. It was giving me insights that I hadn't thought about before. So that's how it kind of shifted.
Yeah. So, how hard is it to pass this test, or how hard was it for W to pass this test, and how did he prepare for it, both within the classroom and outside of the classroom? What was that journey like a little bit?
Yeah. So the test obviously depends on your level of education, literacy as well, even in the first language. Is quite a big issue. So one of the things he told me was with a lot of the Yemeni people he knew, they had maybe low levels of education in Yemen, for example. But he was quite different. He was very much oriented towards education. He wanted to go to university in the past. And he came to the UK in the end. So really the best way to explain it is to put you in their shoes, that you've got this quite dense preparation book, which has got all these different facts and narratives about history and all these different aspects of British life. So you've got this in English, and if you imagine, let's say your own level of English isn't that great, and you've got to figure out a way of understanding this book and then going to the test and then dealing with that in English through its multiple choice test. So that's kind of the problem you have. Then there's other factors that for example, he works in the daytime and he goes to classes in the evening. So already, this kind of reduced the amount of time that he has to prepare for the test. And then obviously, you've got other things on top of that, family life or, your own personal things going on. So then the question is, how do you work around it? And one of the things he did was, he worked really hard. He started going through it and translating a lot of it into Arabic, and then kind of working with it bilingually between English and Arabic, of like trying to make sense of this all, and then practicing the questions. And eventually, he got through, and then he passed. And he told me he was kind of the first one within his, kind of immediate networks to get through it. So, that takes a lot of work, to sit, and he was doing it by hand as well. He showed me the books, translating, and then, maybe highlighting really keywords that he would need that were appearing in the questions, for example. And so that's how he got through it. And then what he did from then was he would help other people who maybe had lower levels of English, maybe lower levels of education, even in Yemen, and help them to get through the test as well. So they would learn again in Arabic. So they basically prepare for the British citizenship test, which is in English and Arabic almost. And so that has all implications as well for the kind of deeper aspects of it, which again we can come on to. But yeah, so only figured out a way for himself to do it, but then he was helping other people to get through it as well. So yeah, that's pretty much how it works. Almost entirely multilingually.
Was that pretty common to see this sort of community driven collective studying and kind of what W ended up doing, which is essentially mentoring people or guiding people through studying for this test? Did people rely on other community members a lot to get through that?
In this study, I mean, I'm really focused on him. I did interview someone who was an English teacher, and she would help people in within the kind of Chinese community in Birmingham. And again, there's different factors that come into it. If you're used to taking tests, even the whole atmosphere can be quite intimidating if you're not used to that kind of test. And what's really different about these type of tests is you've got this kind of government face to it. It's not like going to university or school where it's you're within an educational setting and that's the kind of figure that you've got. This has got a very political element to it, more so than any other test. So I'll give you an example of what I mean as well about that. David Cameron, I think in about 2011, complained that history wasn't in the test. So it was in the book, but not in the test. And then they changed the test to suit, what he said. That's how political it can be. And so this is a very political element. You're dealing with the kind of authority and the weight of the government. So I've done, as I said, I did another project afterwards where we interviewed a lot more people, and yeah, it really depends. What's really significant? There was a period where there was two ways of becoming a citizen. You could take the classes where you just need to show a progression of this very specific course, or you could take the test. And then in I think 2013 they took away the progression route, so you could only pass taking the test. And I think one of the things we found in the second project was what that was doing was actually isolating a lot of women in particular, particularly mothers, because they needed help, but they no longer had that kind of that way of accessing the college to help them get through the test. So then they were either relying on themselves or trying to find someone within the community to help them. So yeah, it's definitely one way of getting through it, especially with so little help available now. And one of the other things that happened as well was there was a point where there was a panorama, which is a documentary program on the BBC, which uncovered these kind of bogus colleges that were just allowing people to pass, basically. So over a very short period of time, it's like closing even more colleges down. So it's cutting, it cuts off a lot of the support that's available. So you really are reliant in the end on either dealing with yourself or trying to find someone to help you.
Wow. Yeah, that accessibility issue that you're bringing up in terms of mothers and various family situations that individuals have, and the lack of support structure seems really big. How many chances do you have to take this test?
You can take it as many times as you want. Every time you have to pay for it as well. So yeah, so that's
Wow.
one other aspect.
How much does it cost?
I'm not sure right now, but I think it's around £50 before I'm not living in the UK now, so I've been quite up to date with it. But that gives you a ballpark figure for how much it's going to cost. Yeah.
Wow, it's pretty. Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of feelings about that. Um, I Yeah, so I guess I'm curious about, you started to talk a little bit about how the multilingual aspect of it and coming into studying for this test and taking this test, translating it into Arabic, then coming back into English. Um, what do you think are some of the implications of that, or what?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really happening is that the the kind of officially endorsed materials are in English only, and the test is in English only. Now, what's the kind of clue within all of this is that because the test is such a product of political discourses and policies, there's been this kind of idea that English is what we need to bring us together, and you need English to be a citizen. It's the most legitimate language you need to be a citizen. So when you have this kind of multilingual preparation, it shows us that in everyday life, that actually multilingualism has a role. English has its role as well, of course, but the way to be able to access English and to improve your English is not necessarily only done in English. It also shows us how communities work on the ground level, that they don't just function in English. that this kind of everyday kind of struggles, require people kind of support in very multilingual ways, which are very context specific. So it shows the reality of everyday life. It's actually quite different from the kind of very ideological national community that only really functions in English. It shows that reality is actually quite different from that.
Hello, everybody. This is Marshall Poe. I'm the founder and editor of the New Books Network. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably love to read. I know I do. So I'd like to recommend you subscribe to Scribd. Scribd is the ultimate reading subscription service, letting you explore all of your interests in any format you choose: ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, and more for only $9.99 a month. All your favorite things are there. You get an entire library for less than the cost of a single book. No complicated credit cards or additional purchases required. If you're not sure what to read, Scribd combines the latest technology with the best human minds to recommend content that you'll love. Want to change things up? You're free to switch between titles, genres, and formats at any time on your phone, tablet, or computer. And here's the best news. Right now, Scribd is offering NBN listeners a free 60-day trial. Go to try.scribd.com/NBN for your free trial. That's try.scribd.com/NBN to get 60 days of Scribd for free.
Yeah, and even this test and structure that's meant to coalesce around the English language isn't. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about belonging and how belonging in the folks you were talking to kind of relates to the citizenship test and the process of preparing for it, but also just belonging more broadly.
Sure. One of the things it's supposed to do really is make people feel like they belong. They're part of the national community. So really, the question then is, is that something you can force out of people, through a test? Now, one of the things that comes across quite often within the two projects that I've done on it is people often compare the test to passing the driving test, the theory test, I should say. So, it's a very mechanical way people get through it. People don't. It's not something people necessarily have a lot of pride about, or instills this kind of pride about. People just tend to see it in very instrumental ways, that it's a test and I need to pass it, because at the end of the day, it is an educational measure. So it's very difficult then to make it inspire a very specific type of feeling, just in the same way any test can do. But then what you have at the end is the citizenship ceremony, for example, and that's that's supposed to create this kind of sense of pride. And I observed a few ceremonies, not just the one that of W's, but I saw a few as kind of preparation, and I've been to quite a lot since as well. And at that time, you've got the kind of whole ambience of it all, and at that point, people really deal with it in very different ways. Some are really proud. Some bring their families and wear their best clothes. For some, it's another day. For some, it's just an admin thing. We found in our second project that most people, what they really want is the passport. At the end of it, and that's not necessarily in some sort of ulterior motive. It's that the passport is materiality, that you're going to be here and you have something with your name that tells you you're British. So that's that's how it kind of, the way the process kind of works for all of that. The belonging thing, one of the things, particularly in language, is that this brings you as an equal, and now you can be as equal as everyone else. And what we found in our second project is that there's this kind of feeling that you're, when people question your English, you're not really being believed to be a citizen like everyone else. And so we use this concept of believability. It's not in the book, but it's in other articles that we've written, where that you're always having to prove something, And I would argue that that continues even for the next generations. These questions of where are you from? Where are you really from? No, but where are you really from? So it can kind of manifest in other ways. So that's kind of how it's supposed to try to create belonging, and maybe the different ways that you may or may not.
how do you see this test evolving? I mean, how do you relate this back to what's happening and what has been happening in the last few years around Brexit and just the European Union and how borders and national identity and sort of a broader collective identity have been shifting in that region? And how does sort of how do we think about the evolving nature of the test, but also of migrants and belonging in those spaces?
Yeah, so I kind of talked earlier about how people kind of laughed a little about some of the questions that were in there, and actually that's kind of a misdirection in a way. One of the questions, so Tim McNamara and Kerry Ryan talk about this, which is the idea of justice, whether you should even have a test at all. And the problem with it is that once you start incorporating this, test like this as a condition to stay, uh, you've kind of got no, it can be taken to its extreme, and that's the fundamental difficulty with the conditionality around citizenship in general. So Jacques Derrida, I used some of his work. He was, born in Algeria, and one day he had, was a citizen, and another day he was, Algerian Jews were expelled from the country, and the citizenship kind of disappeared. And it's that kind of knife edge that it creates, where the moment you have that kind of conditionality, then there's conditions for you to to have your citizenship taken away. So in the UK, we've had some. I don't know if you're aware of it, the Windrush. There was a generation that came over from the Caribbean, very early on in this kind of post-war wave, and there's many of those people who've lived here for so many years, and recently in the last 5-10 years had their citizenship taken away for different reasons. And so that's you're almost playing with fire. How far that can be taken. And I noticed, for example, in the US before Trump ended his kind of a period in power, one of the things he tried to push through was this, a harder citizenship test. The whole point of that is that works within a very, very large kind of apparatus of separating, people from their rights, or making it more difficult at least. So the moment you start having those conditions, it becomes really, really slippery and very problematic. And when language is a condition for that, then what it always has the power to do is to exclude. You can raise the levels, you can make it more difficult, you can add extra exams. So one of the things, for example, in the UK, we had the citizenship test in 2005, but then in 2011 we have this kind of spouse reunification or family reunification a requirement. So what that means is if you have a spouse and you're married, for example, and they're from outside of the EU, they have to take a test before they come into the country. And so so we have like an externalization of borders into from UK into other countries. So if you note that it doesn't really apply to EU citizens, and it's for everyone outside of the EU in kind of non-English speaking countries where it's going to be more onerous. Well, it becomes very racialized in that case because that's mainly Asia, it's mainly South America, for example, Africa. So it's a very dangerous path to take. And now, for example, in Australia, they're having similar family migrant requirements that they're talking about bringing in. So it's a very tricky path, is my point. It becomes a kind of it can be weaponized into separating people from each other, or making access to rights more onerous, or taking them away even. So in terms of Brexit, it's where nobody really knows where we're going with Brexit, how it's going to turn out. But again, what you're seeing with EU citizens who are in the UK is that now they're being assimilated in the kind of more into that kind of non-desirable migrant kind of category, which was maybe protected to some extent by being in the European Union with free movement. So it remains to be seen. But as I said, once you kind of Derrida said, there's a thin line between belonging and discrimination, and so that's where we're at that kind of razor's edge between those two things. So that's kind of some of the debates that are going on here. And actually, not only the UK, but we're seeing more citizenship tests being introduced in other countries as well in Europe.
Yeah, I'm sort of, one thing I'm thinking about, and this is a little bit of a half baked thought, but is, so you mentioned earlier that having the citizenship test isn't necessarily increasing, it may be doing something for individual level feelings of belongingness to some extent, but the marginalization or otherization of those, or othering of those groups who've taken the test, regardless of whether they pass or not, still persists to some extent. And you're saying it persists to some extent across generations, right? So even having that citizenship doesn't necessarily protect you from that othering. And so, in terms of both these assimilationist perspectives and just who benefits from the inclusion of these tests, I don't know. I'm wondering if you have sort of thoughts on, who are these tests serving, and what types of values or ideologies are they maintaining or reifying?
Yeah. So in terms of ideologies, what it really does is it kind of sediments the kind of one nation, one language kind of idea, which is obviously very central to a lot of nation building, historically. So it really kind of puts that into play. One of the things with citizenship tests as well, in terms of the content, is it's kind of a weird genre because on the one hand, it's it has all these useful things about accessing services. It's one of the few places where you really get to see a kind of national narrative in one place, in one book, being played out, what the nation really thinks about itself. Um, so it kind of helps kind of perpetuate some of the you know images a country has of itself. I think what it does as well, I mean, it's one of these things, it promises equality, but kind of reifies, who belongs and who doesn't in order to achieve that equality. Um, in terms of benefits, it's mainly ideological, mainly political, because it's makes very clear what the nation stands for, how you can belong, which is why the kind of idea of becoming was central to the book. How do you become a part of the country? And so I split it up into different dimensions to this. So you've got kind of a technical level to this, which is what you're saying is that there's a very specific level that you need to have your English at to be a citizen. So that's one thing. So then that opens up questions. If your level's below, can you really be a part of the country? Well, obviously we know they can, but that's where it's kind of insinuating. So there's the technical level, there's the ideological level, which is as what I've just explained, but then there's this kind of symbolic level as well that governments and maybe people through because of the political discourses, they want to see that you're trying to be a part of the country, that you're willing to go through this process, that you're willing to spend quite high sums of money to do so. That shows that I want to be a part of this country. And for example, you mentioned about sorry, just repeating about generations, but also you have to remember as well, kind of second project is that sometimes you can have varied citizenship statuses within the same family even, and so that has implications for the family. Even when they're traveling, taking up different queues and then trying to meet up at the end. Different levels of precarity in terms of what's going to happen in the future. So there's different levels it plays out on. One thing I should mention as well is that these things, every time you buy a book, take the test, apply for citizenship, generates money. So there's kind of different levels of who gains from all of this and what they gain.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm thinking a little bit about those different like different statuses within the same family. We see that a lot here in the U.S. as well, and it'd be interesting to think about families where different people are or aren't passing, or families where the whole family is fixated on passing these tests. And yeah, I don't know, just another obstacle into having sort of access into communities and access into belonging. And
Yeah.
um,
Just one point on that.
yeah.
When we did our kind of the second project, the larger scale project, we had this very specific question, which was a lot of the people have what we have indefinite leave to remain, which is maybe what you would consider to be permanent residency in other countries, but it's not being a citizen. It just means you can stay in the country for the rest of your life. So we had this very specific question about why would you, if you can stay in the country, why would you then go on to become a citizen? And one of the most common answers was in case something happens in the future, in case the price goes up, in case they change the laws. I want to get my citizenship now in my hands already. So there's this kind of forecasting that goes on as well, trying to mitigate potential kind of threats, and with the kind of rise of very kind of xenophobic and racist discourses, you could see why they would do that.
Right, the security of the citizenship. But then, as you've pointed out, right, there's this precarity of the citizenship too, where individuals can be stripped of it at any time because
Yeah,
of the
depending. Yeah,
politics of the region.
yeah. So that applies to certain groups, but I guess in the end, the citizenship is about as safe as you can get, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah. No, this has been really interesting. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about what this either this larger project, and then also what it's been like to try to expand this project to the Spanish context, which has a
Yes.
pretty different colonial history.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so we did this second project at the University of Leicester, where so I focused very much on this very tight, case study, basically ethnographic case study in this context with the book. Then we moved on to looking at two different cities, London and Leicester. Leicester's quite similar to Birmingham in terms of very multicultural, history of immigration, and obviously London is quite cosmopolitan. And then we spread that across, you know, about, as I said, over 150 people interviewed in the end, and just seeing what some of the themes that came up were. Um, and the reports are available online for that. But it gives an idea to see different gender, with way gender plays a role. We focused also within the second study. We did half of it more or less, very generally, and then we focused on very specific communities with that, based on some metrics we used within the first half. So we focused, I think, in London on the Chinese community, Latin American, which is growing really fast, and Bangladeshi. And then in Leicester, we focused on the Polish and Indian community. Indians kind of like the big community within Leicester. So, they all had their kind of very specific, issues going on. And now I'm in Spain, which has a very different context. So in Spain, there's obviously the main language is in Spanish, but then you've got these autonomous regions that have their own languages, like Basque, Galician, and where I live in Catalonia, which is Catalan. And what's unusual about the Spanish context is that the test is really new, but it can only be taken in Spanish, even though there's more than one language available, and so it gives a very clear, idea of what a citizen should be, doing. Now, where I live, most people speak Catalan. If you want to work, so obviously I'm part of the kind of immigrant area here because I am one myself. Um, Most people will use Catalan in their daily life, but when it comes to the test, it's only in Spanish. So I'm kind of examining kind of the politics around all of that and what it means for people. Some people, for example, have arrived in Spain, in Catalonia, kind of youngish age, and done their education in Catalan, and what it means for them, for example, where they don't really need Spanish, but they kind of have to go through the Spanish test itself. So again, it perpetuates a lot of self images about Spain. One of the interesting things, even when you go through the material, for example, is the history section starts in 1492, which is obviously the year of the Reconquista, and it starts. The history section starts with kind of the development of the Spanish language, so it kind of gives a very clear, global image of Spain, and also within the national context that Spain and kind of Christianity in Spanish are really really central to it.
Wow. Okay, so I have a couple of questions. First, I would love to hear um, some of the differences or themes that came up across the Chinese, Bangladeshi, Latin American groups, and or Polish, Indian. Because those are. Yeah, I'm just curious about what some of the bigger differences or similarities were across those groups.
Yeah, well, I mean, the kind of main differences, just as a kind of central starting point, was kind of how long they'd been established. So the Indian and Chinese, for example, were fairly well established, and they would have their own issues. So in India, it was the Indian community was a lot of things about spouse reunification, for example, was one. Bringing getting the family unit together. With the Chinese, it was this kind of feeling that quite often they're considered very, silent community, not really spoken about. And they also told us about kind of racism that they'd experienced. Um, Bangladeshi as well. I remember the Bangladeshi was very politically mobile. They mobilized in really effective ways to establish the kind of stronghold within in London. The one I found really most fascinating was actually the Latin American communities, and obviously within that, it's obviously lots of people from different countries. That was kind of the way we had to kind of wrap it up. But also because there's been this challenge in London at the time, anyway, before was to be considered an ethnic minority within the different, in terms of like equal opportunities, for example, and all these different things. So they're really fighting for that at the time. So yeah, it was really interesting to see this kind of really kind of dynamic community growing. It was so diverse and kind of finding its way in London. So I think most of the people I actually spoke to were from Colombia, and it's I didn't realize, for example, even how much it was growing. So it was really fascinating in that respect. And yeah, that's some of the things that came up. The language was obviously quite a big thing, and there was this kind of real big distinction between kind of long established members who really doing, particularly with women, really finding ways to help each other. So that was kind of very generally. We've got a report on it that goes into it in more detail, but that gives you an idea of some of the dynamics.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? That the longer you've been there, the more community support you have, or the more the community knows what you need to do in order to study for the test and pass the test, and support one another in order to get that access. So,
Yeah.
oh, I had another question, which was, so you're in Catalonia. So, what language are your children's learning and speaking?
Yeah. So they speak mainly in Catalan. The school is almost entirely in Catalan, and so they speak in Catalan. Um, but I speak in English with them, and so I've taken on the role of the immigrant dad who doesn't really, embarrasses my children by not speaking their language well. They speak in front of their friends from school, and so I get to experience kind of what my parents must have gone through with us. So but yeah, obviously in England. So yeah, so it's their main languages. They I think they mix it up with Spanish and they can understand it fine. But particularly where we live as well, there's a very high concentration of Catalan speakers. So it's, for example, where we live, it has double the percentage of Catalan speakers compared to Barcelona. Because Barcelona is quite cosmopolitan, and there's a lot more kind of international communities there. So we're in kind of hardcore Catalonia, So yeah, so that's how it kind of plays out.
Is the citizenship test in Spain, is it similar to the test in the UK, or how does it differ?
Yeah, pretty similar. It's a multiple choice. I think the level is slightly lower than the UK. But what they have here is a separate test about language. So actually, in reality, I should have made it clear that the test actually in England, for example, tests two things. It tests your knowledge of life in the UK, and it tests your language at this level, wherever it's going to be. So in England, they put those two things that it's measuring into one test, and in Spain, they kind of split it up almost into two. So you have a multiple choice test about knowledge and culture and things like that, and then you got a separate kind of writing, reading, speaking, listening test in Spanish. So that actually has its own issues as well, because it's basically like a generic language test. And one of the issues that comes up when you do that was that I'm not saying necessarily this one, but just as an example, that the test developers didn't necessarily design it with that context in mind for immigrants. It may have been just for international students, for example. I think that test is kind of it's called the DELE, which is kind of widely used in the Spanish-speaking world. So there's kind of issues about that. I think Glenn Fulcher talks about how it's kind of test misuse, because it wasn't designed for immigrants in mind, and now you're using it for quite significant things in someone's life. So that's basically because those are some of the kind of issues that I'm trying to look into at the moment.
So has using the test in Spain I can't remember when you said that it started, but before and after, has there been a notable difference in what um, I don't know. I mean, is it purely symbolic, or is the exclusion rates of migrants who aren't getting access to citizenship, is that increasing, or what are some of the consequences of enacting this test?
Yeah, I did try to get some of the figures, and they weren't forthcoming about, for example, failure rates and things like that. The test is still fairly new. I think in 2016 it started, so it takes a while for people to apply and go through the whole process. So it's kind of hard to tell at the moment. Yeah, I mean that's kind of what I'm working on at the moment to find out. So it's really only kind of 4 years or so. And then you've obviously got other things that you need to satisfy, like how long you've been living there. Here, sorry. So that's kind of what I'm working on at the moment to kind of build a picture upon that.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating, and it'd be, I mean, I wonder why they're not so forthcoming with that data, but I'd be curious to see, uh, what really has changed as a result of having this test, especially if you're allowed to take it as many times as you want, and it really just is a financial penalty and sort of a symbolic time commitment. What is it really accomplishing in terms of, whose needs is it satifying? So.
Well, we actually wrote an article just to kind of build up when it first came up. It came out. We wrote an article about this with Iker Edosia and Alberto Busos. I should mention them because we wrote it together. But one of the things that came up in the kind of data was actually generated a lot of money. Now we can't say
Mm.
it's solely down to the citizenship test, but it's significant that the kind of year it starts getting coming in, that the kind of profits of the administrators goes up quite substantially. And so you've got this kind of thing where you can't avoid the test. If you want to become a citizen, you can't avoid it. So it's very it's obligation almost, and so there's no other way through it almost. Um, so we'll see how much when I don't know if they'll release any more figures on that, but yeah, there is the financial part, and then as I said, the extreme right here is I think building a lot of momentum here, and you know you don't want to see what would happen if a test like this gets to be in their hands. So that's always what I said before about the danger of this kind of conditionality and these kind of obstacles that they created. If you take it to its extreme, how bad can it get? So yeah, I mean we'll see what happens politically here, but for sure Vox, which is the far right party, is definitely making inroads. There's no doubt about that. So it also shows, as I said before, that the kind of tight links between politics and tests. I think it's. I can't think. I always ask when I go to conferences and things. Can you think of another test where the prime minister can want something to be in it and it will be in there. And
Right.
so I've never. I still can't think of anything else. But as I said, it's pretty uncomfortable times.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it just reminds me of in the most recent census, there was a conversation around Trump and his administration wanting to have questions about citizenship status, and that was a big, debate. But ultimately, they weren't able to pass that or do that or collect that data. But it was a moment of a political figure wanting to include certain things in this large demographic. I mean, I know the census is much different than citizenship tests, but that was also a big conversation over here.
But there is a point there about the first time they knock on the door, you might get away with it. The second time, when they keep knocking at the door with that kind of power, you wonder whether eventually the door is going to break.
Oh yeah,
And
I think we're waiting for our door to break here.
exactly, and that's always the point with when things like this become part of like a wider political apparatus. Is the first time you may hear about it, might sound completely ludicrous, but the more it gets normalized, people start accepting it, and it doesn't seem as far fetched anymore. So I know in Denmark they're thinking about. I don't know how serious they are, but they were thinking about having some sort of test there, and it looked pretty bleak. Some of the things they were kind of talking about. I mean, I'd have to check it again, but I mean, yeah, it's like I said. The first time it always looks a bit strange, when you've never had a test and you want to introduce one, but there comes a point where people start sometimes thinking, all I have to do is do a test, and you don't know where it's going to lead you. So
Right. I mean, in some ways, it just makes me wonder if the ultimate point really is to, push communities increasingly towards a more ethno-nationalist state where we don't have one, or is that the direction that all of these nation states are moving towards? That we had this, extended experiment where we, tried to have other processes in place, and now are we seeing this bigger shift towards, and are these citizenship tests one step towards, really defining a more clear ethno-nationalist state? So that's something I don't know, I wonder about.
yeah, well, like I said, I mean, in the UK context, the test, it kind of comes out of this 2001 from 2001 2005, where there's this kind of repeated attempt to show that multiculturalism has failed. And you can kind of draw a line between that and then the point we get to with Brexit and everything where we are now, where they don't even want to be a part of Europe. It becomes very very insular, even more insular, and it's a pretty sensitive barometer to see, the kind of national temperature, at the time. So yeah, I mean, it kind of all the kind of pieces of fit eventually, when you look at the wider picture.
Yeah, yeah. I guess we'll have to wait and see, and come back together in a few years to see what
Yeah,
where
God,
these
yeah,
tests have gone to, and whether
yeah,
you know whether we're seeing them sort of in every space, and how they're becoming progressively more exclusionary.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, but just one point there as well
Yeah.
is just it's one of the things we found as well in the second project is that it's not only the test, and then it's not only the externalization, for example, the border kind of spouse reunification, but then you get all these kind of micro trials with all of that. So one of the examples in the book, for example, is within the ceremony where they it depends on the ceremony you go to, but there's a possibility where they can watch your lips to make sure you're saying the oath properly.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I mean, you got the test, but then you got all these kind of micro, this continual kind of assessments. And anytime you've got an assessment, there's always a threat you're not going to make it. And that's the way testing works, right? So when you kind of implement that even into the very fine details of someone's life, even though most people are going to get through, but it's the threat, it's always going to be there.
Yeah, and I think I sort of sarcastically wanted to say that's just what immigrant populations need, is they need one more daily stressor in their lives to make
Yeah,
sure that
exactly.
you know
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, Kamran, this has been such a lovely conversation, and I'm really glad I got to read this book, and I'm really glad I got to talk to you about, uh, you know, these citizenship tests, which I'm now going to go look up
Yeah, yeah,
Denmark's
do.
test
Yeah.
and think, I'm looking forward to sort of seeing how this continues and reading about your project in Spain as it develops. So thank you for coming on here and joining us today, and telling us about becoming a citizen.
Thanks for having me on.